The most recent spate of leopard attacks in the Junar forest happened recently in 2024. The 13 villages that dot the area, littered with sugarcane plantations in between patches in the forest, are in for a nightmare if officials can't catch the predators responsible. The village has lost 3 of the most vulnerable members in the last 30 days alone to the leopards. The young and old are the ones being targeted, and tensions are starting to rise. If the government can't find a solution, then parents and families will find another way to protect their kids. It all started with Sanskruti Kolakar on the 11th of April, a 1.5-year-old baby girl who was out in the field with her father. Sanjay took his daughter along for his morning chores as often as he could. He genuinely liked her company, and she certainly enjoyed playing in the shaded grass beside the shed. She was playing just a few yards behind Sanjay when he was setting up a shelter for the sheep he was herding. While the larger human was distracted, the leopard, who'd been watching them for the past hour, finally took the opportunity it had been waiting for. It stalked them from the sugarcane reeds in the field next to them. It was so silent that neither the girl nor her father even heard it coming. When it reached their turned backs, it grabbed Sanskruti and bolted back around to the field. The little girl didn't even have a chance to scream. The leopard's powerful jaws closed around her neck, letting out a bone-cracking snap through the air. It was that sickening crack that made Sanjay turn around, only for him to see his daughter's limp body inside the jaws of the leopard disappearing into the rows of sugarcane. Sanjay snapped out of his stunned stupor and ran after them, but the animal was too fast. Sanskruti was such a tiny child that her weight didn't slow it down at all. All Sanjay could do was to turn back and find help. Authorities jumped into action as soon as they got the alert. They issued drones and helicopters to track the few leopards that had tracking collars, but to no avail. Sanskruti's remains, or what little was left, was later found deep in the fields near the edge of the forest. Almost a month later, a woman in her 30s was attacked while working on a plantation, presumably by the same animal, but she miraculously survived. She nearly lost an arm, and she'll never have full use of it again. This brave survivor prompted the cat to leave the healthy adults alone after that. She'd put up such a fight that she pulled out a chunk of the leopard's skin and hair with her bare hands. The patch of skin she managed to yank out was a significant amount, and that adrenaline-fueled burst of strength was probably what saved her life. Just 2 days later, on May 7th, Rudwa Fatali, an 8-year-old boy, was out playing in the front yard of his aunt's house. He and his family had come from the city to visit relatives in the village of Kulwati. His mother and aunts inside the house heard a blood-curdling scream coming from the front yard. The woman inside the kitchen ran out just in time to see Rudwa's bare feet disappear into the sugarcane field as the spotted cat dragged his body away. Rudwa's relatives stormed in after him, and the leopard let go of his neck to flee from the oncoming horde of ferocious women armed with pots and broomsticks. Sadly, Rudwa was already dead when they reached him, his neck completely ripped out. Now a pattern was starting to develop. All of the fatal attacks were children, and it all happened next to or within the sugarcane fields. All cat species are highly adaptable, but few can compete with the leopards and the cougars. The leopards of India haven't been deterred by the farms that are taking over their habitat like the other creatures. Instead, they've molded themselves in such a way that they've begun to use those neat rows of fields to their advantage, both for hunting and as a safe place to seek shelter at night. This recent man-eating leopard is a prime example of making the best of a situation, though that turns out to be the worst possible scenario for the people who work and live there. 3 days later, the villagers, still reeling from the loss of Rudwa, a 50-year-old woman named Nanubhai Kadale, went out to tend to her farm. Situated next to the row of crops, she was hunched over, with her back facing the field, untangling a hose pipe. This was the moment that the creature watched so silently from the field was waiting for. It sprinted silently toward her, and Nanubai only became aware of the stalker when it sprang onto her back. This wasn't the point-precision aim it utilized with the children. The leopard missed her neck. Instead, its teeth sank into her right shoulder, and its claws sliced through her clothes, raking through the skin on her back. Screaming in terror and pain, Nanubai went down, face first, into the tangled hose and the dirt. Now that it had gotten her off her feet, the animal extracted its teeth and bit down again, and this time its aim was true. It clamped down on the jugular, crushing her windpipe as it did so. Nanubai's screams were cut off abruptly, but it had been enough to alert the workers who were just stepping in through the front gates to start their day just an acre away. Tragically, they were too far off to make it in time to save her. By the time they'd run over, the leopard, with Nanubai still alive and losing consciousness from lack of air and loss of blood, dragged her by her neck into the fields. The farmhands ran after the sound and followed the trail of blood left behind in the attack's wake, screaming and yelling as they went. Their machetes and spades were raised, ready to hack Nanubai free from the beast if they had to. But again, it released her to flee from the approaching mob, ripping out as much flesh as it could fit in its mouth from her neck and shoulder. She was dead by the time the group reached her. The villages surrounding the Junar forest are in an absolute uproar. Authorities are truly putting out every resource at their disposal to catch this spotted serial killer. A curfew has been set in place so that no one is out during the dusk or dark hours. Elders and children are chaperoned by armed patrols. 50 guards have been deployed alongside trap cages, 20 night vision cameras, and they've even started handing out firecrackers, imploring villagers to deploy them at random intervals. So far, the crackers have been the most effective at all. Every time workers set them off before they go into the fields, the sugarcane stalks become alive with rustlings as creatures big and small flee from the blasts. The traps worked very well too, but the success also brought a startling reality to the forefront. It might not be a single leopard responsible for the quadruple attacks. 7 leopards, caught in just 7 days, were captured within the 5-mile radius surrounding the Junar Forest's villages. Determining which animals actually attacked the women and children is impossible, but it could be multiple guilty cats. They hoped to at least identify the leopard responsible for the attack where the woman survived. She managed to rip a piece of fur and skin out of the animal's back, which would make that leopard easily identifiable. But of all the leopards they caught, none of them showed any wounds that matched, so that one is still out there somewhere. Since then, authorities have found half a dozen abandoned lairs that showed signs of cubs having been born there recently. There is no question that dozens of leopards are lurking the forest nearby. In light of this discovery, officials have taken a rather extreme step. They've begun to castrate the males before releasing them in protected parks and forests far away. At least that should curb the sudden population boom in leopards without the need to eradicate a protected animal. But the truth is that this is far from over. Those sugarcane fields are not just sustenance for humans. It's become an ecosystem all on its own, alive with rodents, birds, and snakes. And every year, the animals inside those fields get bigger as they're attracted to the smaller game, leading to an ever-growing problem. With humans now part of the food chain too, with all that food now available, it's not surprising that there's been such a rise in their populations. With the leopard's recent taste of blood, there is no telling how many more will soon meet their terrifying final affliction. Kamala Devi lived alongside the Bandangar Canal, right on the outskirts of the Bandangar National Reserve. And as you'd imagine any reserve in India to look like, it was lush, green, and as wild and awe-inspiring as anyone could hope for. Kamala had grown up here, and she'd known the people in her village all her life. It was where she met her husband, had her children, and saw them get married to the very boys and girls that they'd gone to school with. Now they'd made a grandmother of Kamala all these years later, and she couldn't be happier. Both her oldest daughters were married and had thriving families of their own. Her third child, a son, had gotten married a year earlier, and they blessed Kamala with her 8th grandchild. Kamala still had 2 teenagers at home, and she missed the pitter-patter of little feet running around the homestead. The farmer's life is a simple but hard one. Their community works, lives, loves, and dies together. One circular community where everyone knows everyone. A place where every celebration and loss is shared by the village unit as a whole. And even now, in 2023, most of the people there still live the way they did 200 years ago, and Kamala didn't want to have it any other way. Kamala went over to her son and his wife's house on Wednesday, February 9th, to help the newly married pair with their new baby. The boy was undergoing his first ever cold, and the inexperienced couple were desperate for some advice from the matriarch of the family. The baby wasn't in any serious condition. It was, after all, just a cold. But Kamala appreciated the excuse to go over anyway. She'd left the running of the farm to the 2 teenagers and spent the whole day cuddling the infant while his parents got some well-deserved rest. By late afternoon, Kamala started to head back, walking along the footpath that hugged the tree line of the forest. It was only a 30-minute walk, and she was thoroughly enjoying hearing the sounds coming from the jungle as the birds sang their last songs before settling down for the night. The path was well traveled, with most of the villagers frequenting it almost every day. And since it was just a stone's throw from the tiger reserve, where the animals roamed free with minimal fencing, most of the locals knew to be on the lookout at all times. People rarely traveled alone, even if they had vehicles. But that night, Kamala was by herself, and there was a predator in the trees who was very aware of that fact. But this was no tiger. It was a leopard. Both creatures are equally feared, and in some ways the leopard more so than the Siberian tigers. The leopards are more sneaky, quieter, and harder to see. From India to the southern tip of Africa, the spotted beasts are renowned for their patience and skill. And this fully grown male was no different. It had been hanging out along the path for nearly 2 days, waiting to catch a human alone. It was expecting one of the smaller ones to break away from their group. But the humans didn't act like the wild bucks did. Their mothers kept the little ones close. One human was easy enough, but when many of them were together, they were a formidable force. It wasn't willing to try for one if it was accompanied by someone. The risk was just too great. The cat was about to retreat deeper into the forest for the night, ready to give up on the fruitless day, when Kamala walked past in her bright yellow sari. She stood out like a beacon in the dim light of dusk. Ever cautious, it followed behind her, making sure that she was truly alone. After 10 minutes, the animal was sure that there were no other people traveling the road, and it started stalking her with intent, going down low enough to skim its belly on the ground. It became bolder, stepping lightly onto the pathway, never taking its eyes off the woman's back. If anyone else had been walking behind or towards Kamala, they'd have seen the hunter immediately. Then Kamala's sandal picked up a small stone. Still oblivious to the danger behind her, she bent down to pick it out of her shoe. And that's when the leopard struck. It leapt through the air and onto Kamala's back, its claws grabbing her around the middle. Kamala let out a startled yell that no one could hear, and she was propelled forward into the pebbled walkway. Her hands went out instinctively to break her fall, but the thing on her back was much too heavy to hold. Her elbows quaked as soon as her palms hit the ground, sending her sliding several feet ahead, shredding away the skin on her face and tearing her sari to tatters. Kamala didn't have the chance to comprehend what the claws around her middle that were sinking deeper and deeper into her flesh, or the fierce growling behind her ears were. All she knew was that she couldn't breathe and that she was pinned to the ground. Before the realization could hit her, the animal sank its teeth into her neck. Her chest was compressed from being pinned, and now her throat was pinched shut. She realized that the assailant behind her was a cat, but her closed airways took over the pain from the claws slicing through her organs and the fangs bearing into her throat. She didn't even feel the pain, just that maddening, desperate lack of air. The need for oxygen sent her brain into a panic, and she flayed helplessly on the ground. The animal on top of her remained still and unfazed by the woman's struggles. Instinctually, it knew it had Kamala exactly like it wanted her to be, trapped beneath 150 pounds of pure muscle and completely incapable of breathing. And if the lack of oxygen didn't kill its prey, then she'd bleed out from the femoral artery that was spewing liters of blood into the beast's mouth. And so she did. Kamala perished both from blood loss and suffocation. It took her less than 2 minutes to fall unconscious, and only 1 more minute before the leopard dragged her into the dark forest. By midnight, the entire village was aware of their missing neighbor, and almost all of them were out in the night, walking the route she was known to have taken. Even her son and daughter-in-law, their sick baby strapped to his mother's chest, joined in on the search. One of the villagers found the pool of blood on the road, and with their flashlights, they followed it into the forest. But it was too dark to try to find Kamala, so they had no choice but to wait until morning before following the blood trail. And sure enough, before noon the next morning, they found her, hidden behind a fallen log. But there wasn't much left of her besides her hands, sandaled feet, and face, which still bore the scratches that she'd gotten from being driven over the small stones of the road. The rest of her organs lay scattered across the forest floor. The men who found her turned back to warn the family not to come closer, because all of Kamala's children, grandchildren, and her husband were already on their way. It took all of the village men to drive them back and spare them the gruesome sight. But not even the villagers could bring themselves to collect the pieces that once belonged to their neighbor. Instead, they made a circle around the perimeter to keep any animals away until the authorities arrived. There was no need for an investigation. Everyone could tell by the scene what had happened. All that needed to be done was for her body to be collected and returned to the family so that they could give her a proper burial. The leopard hasn't returned since. Or maybe it's been hiding in the tree line all along, waiting to bring another villager who wanders alone on the trail to their terrifying final affliction.
The morning of June 12, 2022 was the start of a harrowing 48 hours in India, as gut-wrenching news of 3 children being attacked and killed by wild cats, one after another, made headlines across the country. The terrifying news cycle held the nation in the grip of fear, and authorities sprang into action in order to find and stop the predators before they claimed more innocent lives. The attacks happened near the town of Uri, which is a rapidly expanding human settlement in the dense pine forests of the Kashmir Valley. Over a third of the area is covered in trees, surrounded by tall mountains and flowing rivers characteristic of northern India. Apart from being a hotbed of political conflict, the town of Uri is also known as one of the most dangerous places in the world for leopard attacks. These wild cats are the apex predators of the forests surrounding the city and are responsible for hundreds of human fatalities over the years. Leopards are regarded as some of the smallest of wildcat species, but their incredible speed and agility makes up for what they lack in size. They can weigh more than 70 pounds and be over 4 feet in length. These predators have a set of 32 razor-sharp teeth, including canines and incisors over 2 inches in length that can pierce through flesh and deliver crushing bites to the victim's neck to kill it as swiftly as possible. With great night vision and ability to climb trees, the leopard can hunt its prey wherever it finds them, be it on the tall tree trunks or the deep burrows of small mammals. The series of attacks started with a 13-year-old boy, Munir Ahmed, who had gone to a nearby playground for a cricket match with his friends in the Baramulla district of northern India. It was only 3 kilometers from his house, and Munir promised his father he would be back before evening. At around 5 p.m., he headed back home among the tall pine trees that populated the dense forest. He had gone through the area several times before, but rarely walked the forests alone. Little did the young boy know that he was being followed from among the woods by a hungry leopard that had descended from the peaks in the distance and come too close for comfort. Munir heard a rustle on the dry leaves that littered the forest floors behind him and felt an eerie sensation that he was being followed. He looked back nervously, quickening his steps and darting his eyes on the treetops, searching for the source of the sound. He was frightened and alone and tried to gather up the courage to run. Then he heard a growl on his left side and was jumped by a spotted leopard much larger in size than himself. The animal immediately went for the boy's neck, but his collar and sweater momentarily protected him. Munir let out screams of terror, calling for help for anyone he hoped would be listening. The leopard clawed away at him, scratching his face and limbs into a bloodied mess. The animal again aimed for the neck, this time successfully plunging his canines into his flesh. That was the final blow. Munir became the first victim, while paralyzed and unable to scream. The predator gripped him in its jaws and dragged him into the forest to be devoured. Munir's father awaited his return, but every passing minute quickened his heartbeat in concern for his son. It was getting dark and he still hadn't come home. Munir's father ventured out into the woods to find him, and what he saw haunts him to this very day. The dead, mauled carcass of his son lying in a pool of blood among the trees. He mustered courage to take a closer look, and at a glance at his shirt confirmed that it was indeed his own son. The helpless father pleaded him to wake up, but to no avail. He carried him into the town screaming, alerting authorities and police, who realized that something had gone terribly wrong. The very next morning, the city was hit by the shocking news of another brutal leopard attack. 14-year-old Shahid Ahmed had been feeding cattle at his family's farmhouse at 7 in the morning. The cattle and lambs had attracted predators from the forest before, but this time the wild cat was out for a human victim. The young boy had been grazing cattle on the field near his farm when he was ambushed by a leopard from behind. It sprinted toward him with sheer speed, growling ferociously and terrifying the young boy out of his senses. The frightened 14-year-old screamed at the top of his lungs, awakening his parents in the rooms a few hundred feet away. But within these short minutes, the animal had done more than enough damage to him. The boy had deep scratches on his abdomen from the leopard's razor-sharp claws, exposing his vitals. There were also bite marks on his neck from where he was bleeding profusely. Nerve damage and the blood loss left him unable to move or speak, leaving it to the parents to decipher what exactly had transpired. The leopard had run off after dragging him several meters away, and the boy's family picked him up and transported their wounded and bloodied son to the nearest hospital. Only a few hours later, 14-year-old Shahid breathed his last breath in the ICU, devastating his friends and family beyond consolation. His father still shudders, recounting the scene when he first ran to his dying son, and said that his meek and muffled screams of pain still echo in his mind and haunt him in his dreams. The city was still jolted by the news of these two vicious attacks when on Tuesday, another young girl was reported missing in the forests outside of Uri. 12-year-old Rutba Manzoor had been playing in the garden outside her house in the afternoon when she was pounced on by a leopard and dragged into the forest several meters away. The little girl could do nothing in resistance but let out screams that were quickly muted after the animal bit her neck. After several minutes passed and Rutba still hadn't come home, her parents peered out the window to call her back, but she was nowhere to be seen. They frantically ran outside, fearing the worst, but could not see their daughter anywhere. She remained missing for over 3 hours as the town gathered and searched the nearby forests for any sign of the little girl. Little did they know that they would indeed soon find her, but as a half-eaten and bloodied corpse lying beside a tree. Rutba's brother first discovered her body and tried to make sure his parents never saw the condition she was in. The little girl was disemboweled with eyes wide open and a look of terror on her blood-sodden face. But the parents weren't far behind in the search party and soon discovered their daughter's dead body. The sight broke them down completely as they let out helpless cries for their beloved child. They picked up her remains and carried her back to town in intense grief. The 3 attacks within a span of just 2 days sent shockwaves around the world. The brutal nature of the deaths was compounded by the fact that the victims were children. The state government was heavily criticized for not taking action before or even after the news of the attacks had spread. Parents of the third victim, Rutba, staged a massive protest with their townsfolk on the Srinagar highway connecting the city of Uri to the rest of the state. For over 3 weeks, the state government sent handlers, researchers, and shooters into the forest to try and locate the predator. It was gauged from the attacks that there was one man-eating leopard on a killing spree in the city, and it had to be identified and tranquilized. It was several days later in July that the animal was finally located and shot on the spot in the jungle after several failed attempts at tranquilizing it. The Indian government was called on to stop the rapid and unplanned expansion of the towns farther into uncharted forests, increasing the likelihood of a deadly encounter. All residents in the area were ordered to lock up in the safety of their homes before the area could be declared safe. But for the grieving parents of the 3 children, nothing could bring back the light of their lives extinguished mercilessly by a vicious jungle predator in just a matter of a few hours, one after the other succumbing to their unfortunate final affliction.